They threw a 70-year-old veteran out of his own family home. But when his German shepherd started digging under the floor of his abandoned cabin, they uncovered something that powerful people had been hiding for more than 30 years. At 70 years old, Walter Hayes thought the hardest battles of his life were already behind him. After being asked to leave the only home he had left, he drove back to an old forgotten cabin deep in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana. He expected silence, memories, and a quiet place to grow old. But his loyal German shepherd, Atlas, sensed something buried beneath the cabin floor, something no one was supposed to find. What they uncovered would change everything. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from today.
Our community is spread all across the world, and we'd love to know where you're joining this story from. The living room was quiet except for the ticking of a clock on the wall. Walter Hayes sat in the same worn leather chair he had been sitting in every evening for the past 6 years. The chair faced a window that looked out over the quiet suburban street in Spokane. Families passed by, children rode bicycles, and the world moved forward in small, ordinary ways. Walter rarely moved. At 70 years old, movement had become something he did slowly and carefully, like a man walking across thin ice. At his feet lay Atlas. The German shepherd was enormous, his thick coat a deep mix of black and tan. His ears twitched at every sound in the house, even the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Atlas had once been a military working dog, just like Walter had once been a soldier. They had both come home with scars no one could see. Walter's hands rested on the arms of the chair, but they weren't steady. They trembled slightly, the way they always did when the house was too quiet. Silence had a way of letting old memories crawl back into his head. Sometimes it was the sound of helicopters. Sometimes it was the echo of distant explosions. Sometimes it was the face of a young soldier who never made it home. Atlas sensed the change before anyone else could. The dog lifted his head and rested it gently on Walter's knee.
Walter exhaled slowly and placed his hand on the dog's neck. "You're all right, boy," he whispered. But he wasn't sure if he was talking to the dog or to himself. The front door opened. Footsteps entered the house. Walter didn't turn his head. He already knew who it was. Kevin. His son paused near the kitchen for a moment, as if deciding how to begin. Then another set of footsteps followed behind him. Lydia, Walter's daughter-in-law. The air in the room shifted in a way Walter had learned to recognize. Something uncomfortable was coming. Kevin cleared his throat. "Dad, can we talk for a minute?" Walter slowly looked over his shoulder. Kevin stood near the doorway with his arms crossed. Lydia stood beside him, her expression tight and impatient. Walter nodded once. "Sure." Atlas raised his head but stayed where he was. Kevin stepped into the room, but he didn't sit down. That alone told Walter everything he needed to know. Kevin took a breath. "Dad, Lydia and I have been talking about things." Walter waited. Outside, a car drove past the house. The ticking clock grew louder. Kevin continued. "We think it might be time for a change." Walter's eyes narrowed slightly. "What kind of change?" Kevin glanced briefly at Lydia. Then he said it. "We think it would be better if you found another place to live." The words hung in the air. For a moment, Walter thought he had heard them wrong. He leaned forward slightly. "Another place?" Kevin shifted his weight. "You know things haven't really been working here." Walter's voice stayed calm. "I help around the house." "You do," Kevin said quickly. "But it's not just that." Lydia finally spoke. Her voice was polite, but there was no warmth in it. It's the dog. Atlas lifted his head immediately when she said the word. He scares the neighbors, Lydia continued. And honestly, he scares me too. Walter looked down at Atlas. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor. He's trained, Walter said quietly. He was a military working dog. That's exactly the problem, Lydia replied. Kevin rubbed the back of his neck. Dad, Atlas is a big animal. What if he hurts someone? He won't. Kevin sighed. Dad, please try to understand. Walter watched his son carefully, the boy he remembered from years ago. Small, curious, always following him around the house. Felt like a stranger now. When do you want me gone? Walter asked. Kevin blinked. I didn't say. Walter raised his hand gently. You already did. Kevin looked down at the floor. We just think it's time you had your own place again. Walter leaned back in the chair. For a long time, he said nothing. Atlas stood up slowly and placed his head under Walter's hand again. Walter scratched behind the dog's ears. The ticking clock continued. Kevin spoke again. There are apartments not far from here. We could help you find one. Walter shook his head. No. Kevin frowned. What do you mean, no? I won't move into an apartment. Silence fell across the room. Walter's gaze drifted back toward the window. The quiet neighborhood, the bicycles, the normal life he had never quite fit into after the war. I have another place, he said. Kevin looked confused. What place? Walter stood slowly from the chair. Atlas rose immediately beside him. A cabin, Walter said. Kevin's eyebrows lifted. You mean that old place in Montana? Walter nodded. Kevin gave a short laugh. Dad, that place hasn't been lived in for decades. I know. It's probably falling apart. Walter reached down and picked up Atlas's worn leather leash from the floor. That's all right. Kevin watched him. You're serious? Walter slipped the leash over Atlas's collar. Yes. Lydia looked relieved. Well, that might actually be for the best. Walter didn't respond. He walked down the hallway to the small guest room where he had been staying. The room contained very little. A bed, a small dresser, a photograph on the nightstand. The photograph showed a younger Walter in uniform. Beside him stood a woman with bright eyes and a warm smile. His wife. She had been gone for 12 years. Walter picked up the photograph and placed it carefully inside his suitcase. He packed slowly. 2 shirts, a jacket, a few personal items. That was all he needed. Atlas waited patiently near the door. When Walter closed the suitcase, the house felt strangely empty. He walked back into the living room. Kevin stood near the doorway. Dad, I didn't mean for it to happen like this. Walter placed his hat on his head. It's all right. Kevin hesitated. Do you want help driving out there? Walter shook his head. I've driven longer roads. He picked up his suitcase. Atlas walked beside him. They stepped out into the cool evening air. Walter placed the suitcase in the back of his old pickup truck. The truck had been with him for 15 years. Atlas jumped into the passenger seat like he had done 1,000 times before. Walter climbed behind the wheel. Kevin stood in the driveway watching. For a moment, father and son looked at each other. Kevin opened his mouth as if to say something, but the words never came. Walter started the engine. The truck rumbled to life. He pulled away slowly from the curb. In the rearview mirror, the house grew smaller and smaller. Atlas rested his head against Walter's arm. Walter looked down at him. "Well, boy," he said quietly, "looks like it's just you and me again." The road stretched west toward the mountains. Neither of them knew that somewhere beneath an old cabin floor, something had been waiting for them for more than 30 years. Walter Hayes drove through the fading light of late afternoon, the engine of his old pickup humming like a tired companion that had traveled too many miles. Beside him, Atlas sat upright in the passenger seat, alert but calm. The German Shepherd's nose occasionally pressed against the half-open window, letting the cold autumn air rush through his fur. Spokane slowly disappeared behind them. The neighborhoods turned into empty highways. Highways turned into winding country roads. And finally, the country roads began climbing toward the dark outlines of the Bitterroot Mountains. Walter hadn't been back there in more than 3 decades. Not since before the war. Not since before everything in his life had changed. The mountains rose in the distance like silent guardians. Their peaks were dusted with early snow, glowing faintly beneath the last orange light of sunset. Walter's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. Memories had a strange way of returning when you drove old roads. He remembered the first time he had come here. He had been 28 years old. His wife, Emily, had been sitting right where Atlas now sat.
She had laughed when the truck struggled up the gravel road. "This place is beautiful," she had said back then. Walter could almost hear her voice again. He blinked hard and focused on the road. Atlas shifted beside him and rested his heavy head against Walter's arm. Walter gave the dog a small nod. "Yeah, I remember too." The road narrowed as they climbed higher. Tall pine trees closed in on both sides, their dark trunks standing like rows of quiet soldiers. The sky had turned deep blue now. Night was coming. After another 15 minutes, Walter turned off the paved road and onto a dirt trail that curved into the forest. The truck bounced gently over rocks and uneven ground. Branches brushed against the sides of the vehicle.
Atlas lifted his head and began watching the woods carefully. Walter recognized the turn. He had driven it 100 times when he was younger, and yet it felt unfamiliar now. Time had changed the land. Or maybe time had changed him. Finally, the trees opened, and there it was, the cabin. Walter slowed the truck to a stop. The headlights cut through the darkness and illuminated the small wooden structure sitting alone in the clearing. It looked exactly the way Kevin had described it. Abandoned. The roof sagged slightly. The porch railing leaned to one side. Tall grass and weeds had taken over the yard. The windows were covered in dust and spider webs. Walter turned off the engine. The sudden silence of the mountains wrapped around them. No traffic, no city noise, just wind moving through pine branches. Atlas jumped down from the truck first. His paws hit the ground softly, and he immediately began walking in slow circles around the clearing, sniffing the air. Walter stepped out of the truck and stretched his stiff back. The cold mountain air filled his lungs. It smelled like pine and earth and distant snow. For a moment, Walter simply stood there, looking at the cabin. This had once been the beginning of his life. Now it was the place where everything had brought him back. Atlas returned to Walter's side. The dog looked up at him, ears forward, waiting. Walter reached down and scratched the side of his neck. "Well," he said quietly, "let's see what we've got." They walked toward the porch. Each step through the tall grass made a soft rustling sound. The wooden boards of the porch creaked when Walter stepped onto them. He pulled a small brass key from his jacket pocket. The key had been on his keychain for 35 years. He slid it into the lock. For a moment, it wouldn't turn. Then the metal clicked. The door slowly opened. A wave of stale air drifted out of the cabin. Dust hung in the beam of the truck's headlights behind them. Walter stepped inside. Atlas followed closely. The interior of the cabin was frozen in time. Old furniture sat beneath thin blankets of dust. A small wooden table stood near the window. A couch leaned against the wall. In the corner was a fireplace made of rough stone. Walter moved slowly through the room. Every step stirred dust from the floorboards. Atlas walked ahead, sniffing carefully, his nose tracing every corner. Walter ran his hand across the table. Dust coated his fingers. He looked around the room. "This place held up better than I expected," he murmured. Atlas stopped suddenly near the fireplace. His ears lifted. Walter noticed the change immediately. "What is it?" The dog stared toward the dark hallway leading to the back rooms. Walter listened. For a moment, the only sound was the wind outside. Then, a faint creak echoed somewhere in the cabin. Walter's body tensed. His breathing slowed automatically. The instincts of a soldier never really left. Atlas moved closer to him, standing tall, watching the hallway. Walter forced himself to relax. Probably just the house settling. He picked up an old lantern from the shelf near the door and lit it. Warm yellow light filled the room. The hallway revealed two small rooms in the back. Walter stepped forward. The first room had once been a bedroom. The second room had been a storage space. Everything was covered in dust. Nothing had moved. Atlas finally relaxed and began sniffing the corners again. Walter exhaled. He set his suitcase down near the couch. "Well," he said quietly, "this'll do." There was no electricity, no running water. But the structure was solid, and that was enough for now. Walter gathered some old blankets from a closet and laid them across the couch. Atlas circled twice before lying down on the floor beside it. Walter sat on the couch and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The lantern flickered softly. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. For the first time since leaving Spokane, Walter felt something inside his chest loosen. No arguments, no tension. No one watching him like he didn't belong. Just the mountains and the quiet. Atlas lifted his head and studied the room one last time before settling down. Walter leaned back and closed his eyes. But sleep didn't come easily. Not for men who had seen war. Hours passed. At some point during the night, Walter woke suddenly. His heart pounded. His ears rang with the echo of distant gunfire that wasn't really there. Atlas was already awake. The dog had moved closer during the night. His head rested against Walter's boot. Walter reached down slowly and touched the dog's fur. "Bad dream," he whispered. Atlas thumped his tail once against the wooden floor. Walter sat there for a while, staring into the darkness of the cabin. The mountains were quiet, but something about the place felt unfinished, like the land was holding on to a secret. Atlas eventually drifted back to sleep. Walter lay down again. Outside, the wind continued moving through the trees, and deep beneath the wooden floorboards of the old cabin, something remained hidden, waiting for Atlas to find it. Morning came slowly in the Bitterroot Mountains.
A thin gray light slipped through the dusty cabin windows, stretching across the wooden floor like pale fingers waking the room from its long sleep. Walter Hayes opened his eyes before the sun fully rose. He had slept only a few hours. Old habits from the war made deep sleep almost impossible. His mind had spent the night drifting through fragments of memory. Desert winds, distant gunfire, the sound of helicopters cutting across a dark sky. For a moment, he forgot where he was. His heart raced. His hands instinctively searched for something that wasn't there anymore. Then he heard breathing. Slow, steady. Atlas. The German shepherd was still lying beside the couch, his large body stretched across the wooden floor. One ear lifted the moment Walter moved. Walter exhaled slowly. "Easy, boy," he muttered. The cabin was quiet except for the wind brushing against the outside walls. Walter sat up carefully, his joints stiff from the cold night. The lantern had burned out hours ago, leaving the room dim and gray. He stood and walked toward the window. Outside, morning mist hung low across the clearing. The pine trees stood tall and silent around the cabin, their dark needles catching the first light of the rising sun. For the first time since leaving Spokane, Walter felt something strange. Space. The world here didn't feel crowded. It didn't feel like people were watching him. But peace was something Walter had trouble trusting. Atlas stood up and stretched, his paws sliding slightly across the floorboards.
The dog shook his thick coat and walked to the door, waiting. Walter grabbed his jacket and opened it. Cold mountain air rushed inside. Atlas stepped out first. Walter followed, squinting slightly at the morning light. The clearing looked different in daylight. The tall grass swayed gently in the breeze. Frost clung to the edges of weeds near the porch steps. Walter walked slowly across the yard, studying the cabin from the outside. The roof would need work. Several boards on the porch had rotted. The chimney leaned slightly, but the structure itself was solid. Walter nodded to himself. "I've seen worse," he said quietly. Atlas had already begun his morning patrol. The German shepherd moved along the edge of the clearing, nose low to the ground, reading the invisible stories left behind by the night. Deer. Fox. Something smaller. Atlas paused suddenly. His head lifted. Walter noticed immediately. "What is it?" Atlas stared into the trees for several seconds. Then the dog relaxed again and continued sniffing. Walter shook his head slightly. "Probably just wildlife." He turned toward the back of the cabin. Behind the structure sat a small wooden shed that leaned heavily to one side. Walter approached it cautiously and pushed open the creaking door. Inside were old tools, a rusted shovel, a broken rake, an axe with a cracked handle. Walter picked up the axe and tested its weight. "Still usable," he murmured.
He stepped outside again and began clearing the tall weeds around the cabin. Work had always helped quiet his mind. Swing, pull, cut. The rhythm of simple labor steadied his breathing. Atlas watched him for a while before wandering toward the back of the cabin. The dog moved slowly along the wooden wall, sniffing the ground carefully. Walter didn't notice at first. He was too focused on clearing the thick brush near the porch. But after several minutes, Atlas returned, then left again, then returned once more. The dog seemed restless. Walter wiped sweat from his forehead. "Something got your attention, huh?" Atlas stopped near the side of the cabin. His ears stood straight, his nose pressed against the wooden siding. Walter walked closer.
"What is it?" Atlas sniffed again, then scratched lightly at the ground near the cabin foundation. Walter frowned. "Find something?" The dog scratched again. Wood creaked faintly beneath the wall. Walter crouched down and brushed away some of the dirt with his hand. Just old soil, rocks, nothing unusual. Atlas sniffed again, then walked away. Walter chuckled softly. "You're seeing ghosts, boy." He stood and stretched his back. The morning continued quietly. Walter spent the next few hours clearing brush, stacking fallen branches, and dragging broken boards away from the porch. Atlas stayed close most of the time, but every now and then, the dog returned to the same spot near the cabin wall. Sniff, scratch, pause. Walter noticed the pattern but ignored it.
By afternoon, the sun hung high above the mountains. Walter sat down on the porch steps to rest. Atlas joined him, panting lightly. Walter reached down and rubbed the dog's neck. "You remember the desert?" he asked quietly. Atlas tilted his head. Walter stared across the clearing. "I thought coming back here might quiet things down in my head." He paused. "Guess it doesn't work that easy." Atlas leaned his head gently against Walter's knee. Walter closed his eyes. For a moment, the forest was peaceful. But suddenly, a loud crack echoed from the woods. Walter's eyes snapped open. His body reacted instantly. His back straightened. His breathing changed. Atlas stood immediately, ears forward. Walter's heart pounded. For a few seconds, he wasn't in Montana anymore.
He was somewhere else. Hot sand, smoke, gunfire. Walter blinked hard. The forest returned. Just wind, just trees. Atlas stepped closer to him, pressing his body against Walter's leg. Walter slowly placed a hand on the dog's back. "Just the woods," he whispered. The dog stayed close until Walter's breathing steadied again. Even after the moment passed, Walter sat quietly for a long time. The mountains were beautiful, but silence had a way of bringing ghosts back. Late in the afternoon, Walter finally stood again. "Let's see what else needs fixing." Atlas followed him toward the back of the cabin. As Walter stepped inside, Atlas paused near the side wall again. The dog sniffed deeply, then scratched the ground once more. This time, harder. Wood thumped faintly somewhere beneath the floorboards. Walter turned. "What are you doing now?" Atlas scratched again, and again. Walter walked toward him slowly. The dog's claws scraped across the old wood. A dull, hollow sound echoed beneath the floor. Walter frowned. He stomped his boot lightly on the spot. Thump. Not solid. Not like the rest of the floor. Walter crouched down. Atlas looked at him with bright, alert eyes. Walter ran his hand across the dusty boards. Something about the sound felt wrong. Or maybe right. Walter sat back slowly. "Well," he said quietly, "that's interesting." Atlas scratched the same spot again. And beneath the old cabin floor, something shifted. Something hidden. Something that had been waiting a very long time. Walter Hayes remained crouched beside the worn cabin floor, his fingers resting lightly on the dusty boards. Atlas stood next to him, breathing steadily, eyes fixed on the exact same spot. The dog scratched again, this time harder. Claws scraped across wood with a sharp, rasping sound. Walter raised a hand. "All right, easy." Atlas stopped immediately, but kept staring down. Walter knocked on the floor with his knuckles. Thump. Then he knocked a few inches to the side. Solid. He knocked again where Atlas had been digging. Thump. Hollow. Walter leaned back slightly. "Well now." He reached for the old axe he had leaned against the wall earlier that morning. Atlas stepped aside, but didn't leave. Walter slid the edge of the axe head into the seam between two boards. The wood groaned. These boards had not been moved in decades. Walter pushed harder. A nail popped loose with a sharp crack. Atlas's ears twitched. Walter pulled the first board up slowly. Dust fell into the dark space beneath. He set the board aside and lifted the next one. The opening widened. Cool air drifted upward from below. Walter frowned. That's not just crawl space. He leaned closer and brushed dirt away with his hand. Metal. Atlas lowered his head and sniffed deeply into the gap. Walter widened the opening until a square section of floor was removed. Beneath the cabin floor sat a rusted metal plate about 3 feet across. A handle was bolted to its center. Walter stared at it. That shouldn't be there. Atlas whined softly. Walter grabbed the lantern and lowered it toward the opening. The metal plate wasn't part of the cabin's original structure. It looked deliberate, heavy, industrial. Walter ran his fingers across the metal. Cold, solid, and locked. He sat back slowly. Well, I'll be. Atlas nudged the metal handle with his nose. Walter chuckled quietly. You think we should open it? Atlas wagged his tail once. Walter studied the plate again. The edges were sealed into a concrete frame beneath the cabin. This wasn't a trap door someone had thrown together. It was reinforced, which meant whatever was under there had been meant to stay hidden. Walter rubbed his jaw thoughtfully.
Only one way to find out. He grabbed the axe again and used the back of the blade to hammer the rusted latch. The metal groaned. Atlas stood close beside him. Walter struck the latch again and again. Finally, clang. The rusted lock snapped loose. Walter wiped sweat from his forehead. All right. He wrapped his hand around the handle and pulled. At first it didn't move. Years of dirt and rust held it shut. Walter braced his boot against the wooden floor and pulled harder. The metal door gave way with a deep grinding sound. Slowly, he lifted it open. Darkness yawned beneath the cabin. A narrow concrete stairwell descended into the earth. Walter held the lantern over the opening. The light revealed walls made of poured concrete. Dust floated in the air.
Atlas leaned forward cautiously. Walter's pulse quickened. What the hell? He had owned this cabin for 35 years, and he had never known this was here. Atlas stepped onto the first stair. Walter grabbed his collar gently. Hold on. He listened. Silence. No movement. No animals. Just the quiet breathing of the mountain above them. Walter grabbed the lantern and stood. Well, boy, he said softly. Let's see what someone didn't want found. He stepped onto the first stair. Atlas moved ahead of him. The air grew cooler as they descended. Each step echoed softly inside the narrow passage. The concrete looked old but sturdy. This place had been built properly. Military properly. Walter recognized the construction style. When they reached the bottom, the stairwell opened into a small underground room. Walter lifted the lantern higher. The light revealed a space roughly 12 feet wide. Concrete walls, metal shelves, wooden crates stacked against the far wall. Atlas sniffed the ground carefully. Walter walked forward slowly. The room smelled like dust and old metal, but it was dry, well preserved. Walter knelt beside the nearest crate and brushed away the dirt. Military markings, faded but still readable. Walter's brow tightened. U.S. Army. Atlas wandered toward a metal cabinet near the back wall. Walter opened the crate carefully. Inside were sealed metal containers. A second crate held old maps rolled tightly in tubes. Walter lifted one and unrolled it across the table.
The lantern light revealed a detailed map of the surrounding mountains, but something about it stood out. These weren't just hiking maps. They were military survey maps. Walter's stomach tightened. Why would this be under my cabin? Atlas suddenly barked once. Walter turned. The dog had stopped in front of a steel locker against the far wall. Atlas pawed at the door. Walter approached slowly. The locker was locked, but the metal had rusted badly over time. Walter swung the axe once. The lock snapped open. Inside the locker sat a single metal box. Walter lifted it carefully, heavy. He placed it on the table and opened the latches. The lid creaked as it lifted. Inside rested a leather-bound notebook. Walter picked it up gently. The pages were yellow with age.
The first page held a name written in faded ink. Samuel Carter. Walter read it aloud quietly. Atlas sat beside him, watching. Walter turned the next page. The handwriting was neat, precise, military. Walter read the first line. If anyone ever finds this bunker, then the truth was finally meant to come out. Walter felt a chill run down his spine. Atlas let out a low growl. Walter looked down at the dog. You feel that too, huh? Somewhere far above them, the wind moved through the pine trees. Walter closed the notebook slowly. Whatever this bunker was, whatever Samuel Carter had hidden here, it had been buried for decades. And somehow, Atlas had found it. Walter looked back toward the staircase leading up to the cabin. Looks like our quiet retirement just got a little more interesting. The lantern flickered softly in Walter's hand as he stood in the underground room, the light casting long shadows across the concrete walls. Atlas sat beside him, calm but alert. Walter slowly opened the leather notebook again. The first page had already unsettled him. Now he turned to the next. The handwriting remained steady and precise. Samuel Carter had written like a man trained to record information clearly. Walter began reading quietly. June 3rd, 1987. If this bunker is ever discovered, then the truth has either been buried long enough or someone has come looking for it. Walter frowned slightly. Looking for what? Atlas sniffed the metal locker again, then walked slowly around the room.
Walter continued reading. Samuel Carter described himself as a former Army Special Forces operator who had purchased the land decades before Walter ever saw it. Back then, the mountains had been quieter, more remote, perfect for someone who wanted to disappear. Walter leaned against the table as he read. The entries were not ordinary journal entries. They were reports, observations, warnings. Samuel Carter had written about strange movements in the mountains during the late years of the Cold War. Convoys traveling remote logging roads late at night. Helicopters passing low over the ridges without identification lights. Walter's jaw tightened slightly. He had seen enough in his career to recognize the tone. Samuel Carter hadn't been imagining things. Walter flipped to another page. The lantern light trembled as he read. Someone was moving equipment through the mountains. Military-grade equipment, but not through official channels. Walter's eyes narrowed. Atlas suddenly stopped moving. The dog stood very still, ears forward. Walter looked up. What is it? Atlas listened carefully toward the ceiling above them. Walter followed his gaze. The cabin above them remained silent, just wind. Walter looked back down at the notebook. Another entry caught his attention. November 14th, 1988. I believe the operation involves illegal weapons transport. Someone inside the system is helping them move it quietly. Walter let out a slow breath. That's not good. Atlas relaxed slightly and moved back toward Walter.
Walter flipped further through the pages. The entries became more tense as the months passed. Samuel Carter wrote about being followed, about strange vehicles near the property, about hearing digging somewhere in the woods. Walter rubbed the back of his neck. That explains the bunker. Samuel Carter had built it as a safe place to store evidence, maps, documents, anything that might expose what was happening in the mountains. Walter looked around the room again. The crates, the maps, the sealed containers. All of it suddenly felt heavier. Atlas nudged Walter's hand with his nose. Walter scratched behind the dog's ears absently. "You always did have a nose for trouble." Walter flipped to the final pages of the notebook. The handwriting had changed slightly. More rushed, more urgent. March 2nd, 1989. They know I'm watching them. If anything happens to me, whoever finds this bunker must bring these documents to the authorities. Walter leaned closer to the page. Do not trust anyone claiming to represent private companies in this region. Some of them are connected. Walter slowly closed the notebook. The underground room felt colder now. Atlas paced once around the bunker before settling near the staircase. Walter walked toward the shelves and lifted one of the metal containers. Heavy. He opened it carefully. Inside were stacks of sealed envelopes and military-style folders. He opened one. Photographs. Black and white surveillance photos of trucks moving through narrow mountain roads. Walter studied them carefully. Even through the grainy images, the trucks were clearly carrying equipment, not civilian cargo. Walter set the photos down. "Samuel Carter," he murmured. "What were you mixed up in?" Atlas stood suddenly. His ears rose again. Walter turned. The dog was staring toward the staircase, listening. Walter's pulse slowed automatically. His instincts sharpened. He grabbed the lantern and stepped quietly toward the stairs. Atlas followed closely. Walter climbed halfway up the steps and paused. The cabin above them remained silent, but something felt different. Atlas sniffed the air. Walter slowly pushed the trapdoor open and stepped back into the cabin. The late afternoon light had shifted. The shadows inside the cabin had grown longer. Walter scanned the room carefully.
Nothing moved, but Atlas walked straight toward the front door. He sniffed the bottom of it. Then he growled. Low, quiet. Walter's chest tightened. "What is it, boy?" Atlas barked once. Walter stepped forward and opened the door. The clearing outside looked the same as it had earlier. But something caught Walter's eye immediately. Fresh tire tracks. 2 deep grooves cut through the dirt near the edge of the clearing. Walter walked closer. They hadn't been there that morning. Someone had driven near the cabin. Recently. Walter crouched beside the tracks. SUV tires, wide, expensive, not the kind usually seen on logging roads. Atlas sniffed the tracks and growled again. Walter stood slowly. He scanned the tree line surrounding the clearing.
The forest looked peaceful, but Walter had learned long ago that danger often hid behind quiet landscapes. He looked down at Atlas. "Looks like someone else might know about this place." Atlas stared into the woods. Walter stepped back onto the porch. The mountains were growing darker as evening approached. Walter's thoughts returned to the notebook. Samuel Carter had warned about people connected to private companies, people who might come looking. Walter looked back at the open cabin door, then toward the trees. "All right," he said quietly. "If someone wants what's down there, they're going to have to come through us first." Atlas sat beside him on the porch. The wind moved softly through the pines, and somewhere far down the mountain road, a dark SUV rolled slowly toward the cabin. Walter Hayes stood on the porch, the cold mountain wind brushing across his face as he stared toward the tree line. Atlas sat beside him, completely still. The dog's ears were pointed toward the dirt road that twisted through the forest below the clearing. Walter didn't hear the vehicle yet, but Atlas had. The German shepherd rose slowly to his feet. Walter placed one hand gently on the dog's back. "You hear it too, huh?" Atlas let out a low growl. Walter stepped off the porch and walked back toward the tire tracks he had discovered earlier. They were fresh, deep. The ground still crumbled slightly when he touched the edge of one. Someone had been here recently, and judging by the direction of the tracks, they hadn't come up the road by accident. They had turned around near the clearing, as if they were checking the cabin. Walter straightened slowly. His instincts, old instincts from a lifetime ago, began whispering warnings in the back of his mind. The same instincts that had kept him alive overseas. He glanced back at the cabin. The trapdoor to the bunker was still open inside. Walter looked down at Atlas. "We should close that up." Atlas followed him back inside immediately. Walter walked straight to the floor opening and lowered the heavy metal hatch. It slammed shut with a dull thud. Then he replaced the wooden boards over it. The cabin looked normal again. Old, dusty, empty, just the way it had probably looked to anyone passing by. Walter placed the lantern on the table and sat down slowly. Atlas lay near the door but kept watching outside. Walter picked up Samuel Carter's notebook again. The pages seemed heavier now. He turned back to the last entries and began reading more carefully. Samuel Carter had started writing about specific dates, specific vehicles, specific locations in the mountains. Walter studied one entry closely. January 22nd. 3 trucks passed the North Ridge Road at 2:15 a.m. Markings removed. Armed escort vehicle following. Walter frowned. That wasn't random smuggling. That sounded organized. Military organized. He turned another page. Samuel Carter had drawn rough maps of the surrounding mountains.
Several locations were circled in red ink. Supply routes, drop sites. Walter leaned back in the chair. "So you were tracking them," he murmured. Atlas shifted slightly but didn't look away from the door. Walter continued reading. One entry made him stop completely. February 5th. I confirmed it tonight. The operation is real. Someone inside the system is protecting them. I'm not sure who I can trust. Walter's jaw tightened. That line meant everything. Samuel Carter hadn't just stumbled onto something illegal. He had uncovered something protected, something dangerous. Walter flipped to the final page again. If I disappear, whoever finds this bunker must understand. The people moving these weapons will come looking eventually. Walter closed the notebook slowly.
Looks like that day might have finally arrived. Atlas finally moved away from the door and sat beside Walter. Walter scratched the dog's neck absent-mindedly. "You know, boy, we were supposed to come up here for quiet." Atlas wagged his tail once. Walter chuckled quietly. That didn't last long. The late afternoon sun faded quickly behind the mountain peaks. Shadows stretched across the clearing outside. Walter lit the lantern again as the cabin grew darker. He walked over to the window and looked toward the dirt road. Still nothing. Just trees, just wind, just silence. But the tire tracks in the dirt said otherwise. Walter returned to the table and spread the old maps out beneath the lantern light. Atlas sat beside him. Walter traced one of the marked roads with his finger. The same mountain road that led toward his cabin. "Why here?" Walter asked quietly. Atlas rested his chin on the edge of the table. Walter leaned back in his chair. Samuel Carter had clearly built the bunker to store evidence. Evidence he never got the chance to deliver. Which meant something had happened to him. Walter flipped back through the notebook again. Near the middle of the journal, he found a page that had been folded. He opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph. Old, black and white. Walter studied it closely. The image showed a group of men standing beside 3 large cargo trucks deep in the mountains. But what caught Walter's attention wasn't the trucks. It was the man standing slightly apart from the others. A tall man wearing a dark coat. Even in the old photo, his face was sharp and confident. Walter stared at it longer than expected. Something about the man's posture seemed familiar. Atlas suddenly stood again. Walter looked up. This time, he heard it. A faint sound carried through the trees, the low rumble of an engine. Walter froze. Atlas moved toward the door silently. Walter blew out the lantern. The cabin went dark. Outside, the engine sound grew slightly louder. Then it stopped. Walter moved slowly to the window. He peered through the dusty glass toward the road. Headlights flickered briefly between the trees, then disappeared. Someone had stopped somewhere below the clearing.
Atlas's growl vibrated through the quiet cabin. Walter whispered softly, "Easy." But his own heart had started beating faster. He stepped back from the window. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, Walter realized something important. Samuel Carter had been right. Whatever had been hidden in these mountains, someone was still looking for it. And now, Walter Hayes and Atlas had found it first. The cabin remained dark. Walter stood beside the window, barely breathing as he watched the black outline of the forest. The headlights below the clearing had disappeared, but the silence didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt watched. Atlas stood beside him, muscles tight, ears pointed toward the dirt road. The dog let out a low rumble in his chest.
Walter placed a calming hand on the thick fur behind Atlas's neck. "Easy, boy." The sound of a car door slamming echoed faintly through the trees. Walter's eyes narrowed. Someone had gotten out of that SUV. He slowly stepped away from the window and moved toward the door. Atlas followed without a sound. Walter opened the door just an inch and looked outside. The clearing lay quiet beneath the pale light of the rising moon. Wind brushed through the tall grass. Nothing moved. But Walter had learned long ago that danger rarely made itself obvious. He closed the door quietly. For the next 15 minutes, the two of them waited. Atlas remained alert. Walter listened. Then, footsteps. Faint. Crunching softly through gravel. Walter moved back toward the window. This time he saw them. 2 silhouettes emerging from the trees at the edge of the clearing. Both men wore heavy jackets. One carried a flashlight. The beam moved slowly across the ground as they walked toward the cabin. Walter stepped away from the window. Atlas growled again. Walter whispered quietly, "Stay." He lit the lantern again. If they were going to talk, he didn't want to look like a man hiding in the dark. The men reached the porch. One of them knocked firmly on the door. Walter waited 2 seconds. Then he opened it. The man standing closest was tall and broad-shouldered, probably in his early 40s. His beard was neatly trimmed, and his eyes moved quickly across the room behind Walter. The second man stood slightly behind him, silent. The tall man smiled politely. "Evening." Walter leaned against the doorframe. "Evening." The man glanced down at Atlas. "That your dog?" Walter nodded once. "Name's Atlas." The man studied the dog carefully. "Big animal. He's friendly if people are." The man chuckled softly. "Fair enough." He extended a hand. "Name's Richard Doyle." Walter didn't take the hand. "Walter Hayes." Richard withdrew his hand casually. Well, Mr. Hayes, didn't expect anyone to be living up here. Walter shrugged. Just moved back. Richard nodded slowly. We noticed the truck when we drove past earlier. Walter said nothing. Richard continued speaking as if the silence didn't bother him.
My associate and I work for a mineral exploration company. He gestured toward the mountains behind them. We've been surveying this region for possible development. Walter raised an eyebrow slightly. Development? Mining operations, mostly rare earth minerals. Walter crossed his arms. And that brings you to my cabin? Richard smiled again. Well, technically, to your land. Walter waited. Richard's smile widened slightly. You see, Mr. Hayes, your property happens to sit right in the middle of an area that's very interesting to our company. Walter looked out across the clearing. Is that right? Yes, sir. Richard shifted his weight. So we were hoping to speak with you about purchasing the land. Walter laughed quietly.
You drove all the way up here at night to make a real estate offer? Richard shrugged. Time is money. Walter studied him carefully. What kind of money? Richard looked toward the trees briefly before answering. More than enough to make it worth your while. Walter shook his head. Not interested. Richard blinked. You haven't even heard the number. Doesn't matter. Richard's smile faded slightly. You sure about that? Walter's voice stayed calm. I just got here, not planning on leaving yet. The second man finally spoke. His voice was deeper. You might want to reconsider. Atlas stepped forward slightly. Walter placed a hand on the dog's collar. Careful, Walter said quietly. The tall man raised a calming hand toward his partner. Easy. He looked back at Walter. No need for tension. Walter shrugged. Then maybe you should head back down the mountain. Richard exhaled slowly. Well, Mr. Hayes, if you change your mind, our company is willing to make very generous offers. Walter nodded toward the road. I'll keep that in mind. Richard studied him for another moment. Then he stepped back off the porch. The second man followed. As they walked toward the tree line, Richard turned back one last time. Oh, one more thing. Walter waited. Richard pointed casually toward the ground. Interesting property you've got here. Walter said nothing. Richard continued. Lot of old stories about these mountains. Walter leaned against the doorway. Every mountain has stories. Richard smiled again. That's true. Then the two men disappeared into the trees. Several minutes later, the low rumble of the SUV engine returned. The vehicle slowly drove away down the mountain road. Walter remained standing on the porch long after the sound faded. Atlas walked down to the tire tracks in the dirt. The dog sniffed them carefully. Then he growled. Walter looked down at him. You don't trust them either, huh? Atlas's tail stayed stiff. Walter stared into the darkness of the forest. Those men had known exactly where to find him, and they had come far too quickly, which meant something else. Someone else. Walter turned and walked back into the cabin. He closed the door slowly. Atlas followed. Walter relit the lantern and looked down at the wooden floorboards that hid the bunker. Samuel Carter's warning echoed in his mind. Do not trust anyone claiming to represent private companies. Walter rubbed his tired eyes. Well, Carter, he muttered quietly. Looks like you weren't paranoid after all. Atlas suddenly lifted his head again. His ears pointed toward the woods. Walter frowned. What now? Atlas walked toward the door again. Then he barked once, Sharp, urgent. Walter opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The clearing looked empty, but something in the distance caught his eye. A faint red light flickered briefly deep among the trees, then vanished. Walter's chest tightened. Someone hadn't left. Someone was still out there, watching the cabin. Walter Hayes remained on the porch for several long seconds, his eyes fixed on the dark line of trees where the faint red light had disappeared. The forest had gone quiet again. Too quiet. Atlas stepped forward beside him, muscles tight beneath his thick coat. The German shepherd's nose lifted toward the wind, testing the air. Walter whispered softly, "You see it too, don't you?" Atlas let out a low growl. Walter stepped back into the cabin and closed the door carefully. He lowered the lantern flame until the room dimmed again. The less light inside the cabin, the harder it would be for someone outside to see him. Atlas moved from window to window slowly, sniffing and listening. Walter stood near the table, staring at the wooden boards that covered the bunker below. Samuel Carter's warning echoed in his mind again. Do not trust anyone claiming to represent private companies. Walter rubbed his face slowly. Looks like Carter knew something big, he muttered. Atlas suddenly stiffened. The dog's head snapped toward the back wall. Walter froze. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Very faint, moving around the side of the cabin. Walter's body reacted instantly. His breathing slowed. His shoulders tightened. Old instincts took over. He moved quietly toward the wall and blew out the lantern. The cabin plunged into darkness. Atlas stood completely still beside him. The footsteps stopped. For several seconds, nothing moved. Then, a scraping sound. Metal against wood. Walter's heart began to pound. Someone was trying the back door. Atlas bared his teeth silently. The handle moved. Once. Twice. Then stopped. A shadow passed across the small window. Walter grabbed the old axe he had leaned against the wall earlier. Atlas lowered his body, ready. Another sound came from the back porch, glass crunching under boots. Walter whispered, "Stay." But Atlas had already decided. The dog moved toward the door slowly. Walter positioned himself beside the wall. The door handle turned again, this time harder. Then, the door burst open. A man stepped inside quickly, a flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Search the place," a voice whispered behind him from outside. The beam swept across the room. The man didn't see Walter. He didn't see Atlas either. The flashlight moved toward the center of the cabin. Then the man took another step forward. That was when Atlas moved. The German shepherd launched forward with explosive speed. A deep bark thundered through the cabin. The man shouted in shock as Atlas slammed into him. The flashlight fell to the floor. The room filled with chaos. Walter stepped forward, raising the axe. But the man had already pulled a knife. Atlas grabbed the man's arm with powerful jaws. The attacker cried out and swung wildly. Walter shouted, "Drop it!" But the man twisted violently. The knife flashed. Walter heard a sharp sound. Then Atlas yelped. Walter's chest tightened. "Atlas!" The dog stumbled back. A dark stain spread quickly across the snow, just outside the door where the struggle had moved. The attacker shoved Atlas away and ran. Walter rushed forward, but by the time he reached the doorway, the man had already disappeared into the trees. Branches snapped as the figure fled into the darkness. Walter didn't chase him. He turned immediately. Atlas lay on the ground near the porch steps, breathing hard. Walter dropped to his knees beside him. Hey, easy boy. Atlas tried to stand but couldn't. Walter's hands moved quickly across the dog's body. Then he found it. Blood. Warm. Wet. A deep cut along the dog's shoulder where the knife had struck. Walter's stomach twisted. Damn it! Atlas looked up at him, ears weakly twitching. Walter forced his voice to stay calm. You're all right. I've got you. He slid one arm beneath the dog's chest and lifted carefully. Atlas was heavy, but Walter carried him inside the cabin. He placed the dog gently on the old couch. The lantern was still on the table. Walter lit it again with shaking hands. Light filled the room. The wound looked worse now. Blood soaked into the dog's fur. Walter moved quickly toward his suitcase and pulled out an old medical kit. It wasn't much, just basic supplies he had carried since his military days, but it would have to do. Walter knelt beside Atlas and began cleaning the wound carefully. The dog didn't snap, didn't panic. He simply watched Walter quietly. Good boy, Walter whispered. You saved me again. Atlas's tail thumped weakly once against the couch. Walter wrapped the wound tightly with gauze and tape. The bleeding slowed, but the dog was exhausted. Walter sat back slowly. His hands were stained with blood. For a long moment, he simply looked at Atlas. You stubborn fool, he muttered softly. Atlas blinked slowly. Walter leaned forward and rested his forehead against the dog's head. Outside, the wind pushed snowflakes across the clearing. The mountains had grown colder during the night. Walter sat beside the couch, watching Atlas breathe. The cabin felt different now. Not quiet. Not peaceful. Danger had arrived. And it had nearly taken the one companion Walter had left. Walter stood slowly and walked to the door. He looked out toward the forest again. The trees were still. But somewhere out there, the man who had attacked them was running back to whoever had sent him. Walter's jaw tightened. He looked back toward Atlas. You rest, he said quietly. Then he picked up Samuel Carter's notebook from the table. Walter flipped it open again. If someone was willing to break into the cabin, if someone was willing to hurt Atlas, then whatever was hidden in that bunker below them was worth far more than land. Walter turned to the last page Carter had written. His voice was barely a whisper. What exactly did you leave me, Carter? Atlas lifted his head weakly from the couch. His eyes met Walter's. And in that silent moment, Walter understood something. This fight wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun. The wind outside the cabin howled softly through the tall pines as snow drifted across the clearing. The mountains had turned silent again, but the quiet now felt tense, as if the forest itself were waiting. Inside the cabin, Walter Hayes sat beside the old couch, watching Atlas breathe. The German shepherd lay on his side, bandages wrapped tightly around his shoulder. The gauze had soaked through slightly, but the bleeding had slowed. Walter rested one hand gently on the dog's back. Stay with me, buddy. Atlas's chest rose and fell slowly. For hours, Walter didn't sleep. The lantern burned low on the table, casting warm light across the rough wooden walls. Outside, snow continued falling, covering the tire tracks that had led the strangers to the cabin. Walter kept replaying the attack in his mind. The knife. The man's voice. The way Atlas had launched forward without hesitation. Just like the old days. Walter's eyes drifted toward the scar on Atlas's side. a faded line from years earlier. That scar had come from Iraq. Atlas had taken a piece of shrapnel meant for him. Walter exhaled slowly. You never learn, do you? Atlas's ears twitched slightly. The dog wasn't unconscious, just exhausted. Walter stood and added another log to the small iron stove. The fire cracked quietly. Heat spread through the cabin. Walter returned to the couch and knelt beside Atlas again. Carefully, he checked the bandage. The wound was deep but clean. The knife hadn't struck bone. Walter nodded slightly. You're tough. Always were. Atlas lifted his head weakly. His eyes met Walter's. The dog tried to stand. Walter gently pushed him back down. Not tonight. Atlas huffed softly, but obeyed. Walter sat back on the floor and leaned against the couch. For the first time in hours, he allowed his mind to slow. The mountains outside had always been a place of quiet reflection for him, but tonight they felt different. Samuel Carter's notebook sat open on the table. Walter stood and walked over to it. If those men were willing to break into the cabin, then the answers in that bunker were far more important than he had first thought. Walter picked up the notebook and began reading again. Atlas watched him from the couch. The later entries in the journal were harder to read. Samuel Carter's handwriting had grown rushed and uneven. Walter read one passage slowly. March 18th, 1989. I believe they know I have proof. Vehicles have been circling the property for 2 nights. Walter frowned. That sounded familiar. He turned the page. March 20th. If I disappear, the evidence in the bunker must reach someone who still believes in the law. Walter closed the notebook slowly. Samuel Carter had known the danger. He had hidden the documents because he had nowhere else to put them. Walter looked toward the trapdoor beneath the floor. The bunker, the crates, the maps. All of it had been waiting underground for more than 30 years. Waiting for someone to find it. Atlas lifted his head again. The dog's ears twitched toward the door. Walter turned. You hear something? Atlas slowly pushed himself up. Walter stood quickly. Hey, easy! But Atlas ignored him. The dog stepped carefully off the couch. His injured shoulder trembled slightly, but he refused to lie down. Walter sighed. You stubborn old soldier. Atlas walked toward the door and sniffed the air. The dog's tail wagged once. Walter frowned. That's new. He opened the door slowly. Cold mountain air rushed into the cabin. The snow had stopped falling. Moonlight covered the clearing in pale silver. Atlas stepped outside carefully. Walter followed close behind. The clearing looked peaceful again, but something had changed. Atlas walked toward the edge of the clearing where the tire tracks had been earlier. The snow had covered most of them, but the dog wasn't interested in the tracks. He moved toward a spot near the woodpile. Walter watched quietly. Atlas sniffed the ground. Then he pawed at something buried beneath the snow. Walter stepped closer. What did you find? Atlas scratched again. Walter brushed the snow aside with his boot. Something dark appeared beneath the powder. Metal. Walter bent down and picked it up. A small object. He wiped the snow away. It was a flashlight. Not the cheap kind. A heavy, tactical model. Walter turned it in his hand. The glass was cracked. Probably dropped during the struggle earlier. Walter studied it carefully.
Then he noticed something etched into the metal. A small symbol. A company logo. Walter's eyes narrowed. He had seen that mark before. Not in the bunker, but in one of Samuel Carter's photographs. Walter looked back toward the forest. Looks like they left something behind. Atlas wagged his tail once. Walter rubbed the dog's head gently. You might have just given us our first real clue. Atlas leaned against him. Walter stared at the flashlight again. Whatever Samuel Carter had uncovered decades ago, the same people, or someone connected to them, were still searching for it. Walter looked toward the dark mountains surrounding the cabin. They think we're just two old soldiers hiding in the woods. Atlas sat beside him. Walter smiled faintly.
That might be their first mistake. The wind moved through the trees again, and somewhere beyond the ridges, the truth buried in the mountains was beginning to surface. Walter Hayes stood in the clearing for a long moment, the cold flashlight still resting in his hand. Atlas leaned against his leg, breathing slowly. The snow had stopped, and the sky above the Bitterroot Mountains was clear. Stars stretched across the darkness like scattered ice. Walter turned the flashlight over again. The etched symbol on the metal casing caught the moonlight. He had definitely seen it before. Walter walked back toward the cabin. Atlas followed, his injured shoulder stiff but steady. Inside, Walter closed the door and set the flashlight beside the lantern.
He pulled Samuel Carter's notebook closer and flipped through the pages again. Atlas settled near the stove, watching him. Walter searched through the entries until he found the photograph he had studied earlier, the black and white image of trucks parked in a mountain valley. He lifted it closer to the lantern. Then he saw it. The same small symbol was painted faintly on the side of one of the escort vehicles. Walter's eyes narrowed. So you were watching the same people, he murmured. Atlas thumped his tail softly against the wooden floor. Walter leaned back in his chair. Samuel Carter hadn't just suspected a weapons operation. He had documented it. The maps, the surveillance photos, the reports. Everything in that bunker had been collected as proof. Walter stood up slowly. Looks like it's time we go back downstairs. Atlas rose immediately, limping slightly but determined. Walter lifted the floorboards again and opened the metal hatch. Cold air rose from the bunker below. He grabbed the lantern and began descending the concrete steps. Atlas followed carefully behind him. The underground room looked exactly as they had left it. Silent. Still. Walter walked to the metal shelves and began opening the sealed containers one by one. Inside were more folders, more photographs, more maps. Atlas sniffed the crates while Walter sorted through the documents. Each piece added another fragment to the story. Shipping manifests, license plate numbers, handwritten notes connecting vehicles to certain routes through the mountains. Walter exhaled slowly. This wasn't small. Atlas sat beside him. Walter opened the final metal box. Inside was a thick envelope sealed with wax. He broke it open carefully. Several official-looking documents slid onto the table. The first page carried a heading that made Walter's stomach tighten. Confidential Investigation Report. Walter read silently for several minutes. The report described a covert operation that had been exposed in the late 1980s. Illegal weapons had been transported through remote mountain routes and sold to international buyers. Someone inside the system had allowed it, protected it, covered it up. Samuel Carter had discovered the network while working in the region. Walter flipped to the final page of the report. At the bottom was Carter's handwritten note. Evidence stored safely until the right person finds it. Walter rubbed his jaw slowly. You didn't trust the system. Atlas lifted his head. Walter looked down at him. Maybe you were right. He gathered several of the most important folders and placed them on the table. The documents were clear. The evidence was detailed. Even after 30 years, the truth was still powerful. Walter climbed the stairs again and sealed the bunker behind him. Atlas followed. Back inside the cabin, Walter sat at the table again. He studied the evidence under the lantern light. If the men from the SUV were connected to the same operation, then they were trying to destroy whatever Carter had hidden.
Which meant someone needed to see this before it disappeared again. Walter leaned back in his chair. There's only one way this ends. Atlas watched him quietly. Walter reached for the old radio on the shelf. It crackled faintly as he turned it on. There was no signal out here, not enough for calls. But the nearest town was only 40 minutes away. Walter picked up the photograph again. The man standing beside the trucks, the one in the dark coat. He looked familiar, too familiar. Walter's eyes widened slightly. Wait a second. He leaned closer to the lantern. Years had passed since that photo had been taken. But the posture, the shape of the face. Walter remembered where he had seen it before. Earlier that evening. Standing on the porch, smiling politely. Richard Doyle. Walter's pulse quickened. Atlas rose to his feet. Walter looked down at him. The mining company, he said quietly. Not a mining company at all. Atlas's ears lifted. Walter stood slowly. He gathered the most important documents into a small stack. These need to get to someone who can't be bought. Atlas limped closer. Walter rested a hand on the dog's head. Tomorrow, we head into town. Atlas wagged his tail once. Walter looked toward the dark window. If Richard Doyle realized that Walter had seen the documents, they would come back. And next time, they wouldn't come quietly. Walter lowered the lantern flame and sat beside Atlas on the floor. The old soldier and the loyal dog rested together while the mountains slept. But deep in the shadows beyond the forest road, men were already planning their next move. Because the truth buried in the Bitterroot Mountains was no longer hidden. And someone was about to make sure the world finally saw it. Morning arrived slowly over the Bitterroot Mountains. The first light of dawn crept through the tall pines and spread across the frozen clearing in front of the cabin. Walter Hayes stood on the porch with a mug of black coffee warming his hands. Atlas sat beside him. The German shepherd's shoulder was still wrapped in thick bandages, but the dog insisted on standing guard like he always had. Walter looked down at him. You should still be resting. Atlas ignored him and stared toward the dirt road. Walter smiled faintly.
Stubborn. The old pickup truck waited beside the cabin, frost covering the windshield. Walter had packed the documents inside a weathered canvas bag. The moment Atlas was strong enough to travel, they would head down the mountain to the nearest town. Someone needed to see Samuel Carter's evidence. But before Walter could finish his coffee, the distant rumble of an engine echoed through the forest. Atlas's ears rose immediately. Walter turned slowly toward the road. Another vehicle was coming. The sound grew louder as it climbed the narrow mountain path. Walter set his mug down carefully on the porch railing. Not this early, he muttered. The engine finally appeared between the trees, a silver SUV. But it wasn't the same one from the night before. This one was older,
dust-covered. The vehicle rolled slowly into the clearing and stopped. Walter stepped down from the porch. Atlas stood beside him, alert. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out. Younger, mid-30s. Walter felt a strange tightening in his chest the moment he saw his face. Dad? Walter didn't move. Kevin Hayes stood beside the SUV, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Atlas glanced between the two men. Kevin walked forward slowly. I heard what happened. Walter frowned. Heard what? Kevin hesitated. There was a report in town this morning. Some guy showed up at the clinic with a broken arm. Said he got attacked by a dog near an old cabin in the mountains. Walter crossed his arms.
Well, that part's not wrong. Kevin looked at Atlas. The big German shepherd watched him carefully, but didn't growl. Kevin's eyes softened. He protected you, didn't he? Walter nodded once. Kevin exhaled slowly and looked around the clearing. The old cabin, the stacked firewood, the repaired porch railing. Walter had only been here a short time, but the place already looked different, more alive. Kevin walked a few steps closer. I shouldn't have asked you to leave. Walter remained silent. Kevin rubbed the back of his neck. Things were complicated. Walter let out a quiet breath. Life's always complicated. Kevin looked toward the mountains. I didn't realize how much you'd been carrying. Walter studied his son's face.
For the first time in years, Kevin looked uncertain. Younger. Almost like the boy Walter used to take camping in these same mountains. Kevin finally spoke again. When Mom died, you shut down, and I didn't know how to help. Walter looked away toward the trees. The wind moved softly through the branches. Atlas stepped forward and sat between them. Kevin knelt slowly and extended a hand. Atlas sniffed it carefully, then wagged his tail. Kevin smiled faintly. Guess he remembers me. Walter's voice softened. He remembers everyone who treated him right. Kevin looked up. I saw the news this morning. Walter frowned. What news? Kevin pointed toward the cabin. Some local reporter is asking questions about an old weapons case from the 80s.
Apparently someone contacted them overnight. Walter's expression didn't change. Kevin studied him carefully. You didn't go into town yet? No. Kevin nodded slowly. But someone tipped them off. Walter didn't answer. Kevin looked toward the mountains again. I think those men who came here last night, they're in trouble. Walter leaned against the porch post. That depends. On what? On whether the truth actually gets out. Kevin looked confused. Walter walked inside the cabin and returned with the canvas bag. He placed it on the porch railing. Kevin watched as Walter opened it. Inside were the folders from the bunker. Maps, reports, photographs. Kevin picked one up slowly. What is all this? Walter looked toward the mountains.
A man named Samuel Carter died trying to protect it. Kevin flipped through the documents. His eyes widened. This is real? Walter nodded. Kevin sat down heavily on the porch step. Dad, this could expose a lot of people. Walter rested one hand on Atlas's head. That's the idea. Kevin looked up at him. You going to turn this in? Walter stared across the valley. Yes. Kevin hesitated. Those men won't let that happen easily. Walter smiled slightly. They already tried. Atlas barked once. Kevin laughed softly. I guess they didn't expect Atlas. Walter looked down at the dog. Most people don't. For a moment, the three of them sat quietly on the porch. The mountains stretched endlessly around them. Kevin finally spoke again. You know, if you ever wanted to come back home. Walter raised a hand gently. This is home now. Kevin nodded slowly. For the first time, he understood. Walter Hayes had returned to the place where he truly belonged. Kevin stood up. I'll help you take those documents into town. Walter looked surprised. You don't have to. Kevin shook his head. Yes, I do. Atlas wagged his tail. Walter looked at the rising sun over the Bitterroot Mountains. After everything that had happened, after the betrayal, after the danger, For the first time in years, Walter felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Because no matter what happened next, he wasn't alone anymore. The mountains looked different in the morning light. Walter Hayes stood beside his old pickup truck, while Kevin secured the canvas bag of documents in the back seat. The cold air carried the scent of pine and snow across the clearing. Atlas sat beside the porch, watching everything carefully. The bandage on his shoulder was still fresh, but the dog stood tall as always. Walter looked down at him. "You sure you're up for the ride?" Atlas wagged his tail slowly. Kevin smiled. "I think that means yes." Walter nodded once. The three of them climbed into the truck. The engine coughed once before roaring to life. Walter guided the vehicle slowly down the narrow dirt road that twisted through the Bitterroot Mountains. Atlas sat upright between the seats, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The drive into town took nearly 40 minutes. Neither Walter nor Kevin spoke much during the ride. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the quiet kind that came after something heavy had finally lifted. When they reached the small mountain town, the streets were already busy. Pickup trucks lined the main road. A few locals stood outside the diner with coffee cups in their hands. Walter parked beside the sheriff's office. Kevin glanced at the canvas bag. "You ready?" Walter exhaled slowly. "Been ready for 30 years. They stepped inside. The sheriff, a gray-haired man named Frank Donovan, looked up from behind his desk. "Walter Hayes?" Walter nodded. "Morning, Frank." The sheriff stood and shook his hand. "Heard you were back in the mountains." Walter placed the canvas bag on the desk. "I brought something you need to see." Frank opened the bag and began pulling out the folders. Maps, reports, photographs. His eyebrows slowly rose as he scanned the pages. "Where did you get all this?" Walter leaned against the counter. "Hidden bunker beneath my cabin." Frank stared at him. "You're serious?" Walter nodded. Kevin added quietly, "It was built by a man named Samuel Carter." Frank's expression changed instantly. "I know that name." Walter waited. Frank turned the pages more carefully now. "Carter disappeared back in the late 80s, the sheriff said. Some people believed he'd uncovered something big." Walter crossed his arms. "He did." Frank looked up. This could reopen an entire federal investigation." Walter shrugged.
"Then maybe it's time." Frank closed the folder slowly. "You mind if I call this in?" Walter shook his head. "That's why we're here." Atlas sat quietly near the door, watching the room. Kevin knelt beside him and scratched behind his ears. "You're a hero, you know that?" Atlas wagged his tail once. The sheriff picked up the phone and stepped into his office. For several minutes, the room remained silent. Walter watched the sunlight spill through the window onto the wooden floor. When Frank returned, his expression looked stunned. "They're sending investigators from Helena." Walter nodded. "Good." Frank leaned on the desk. "Walter, this evidence could expose people who've been hiding for decades." Walter looked toward Atlas.
"That's the plan." The news traveled fast through the town. By the afternoon, a reporter had already arrived asking questions about the old bunker in the mountains. The story spread quickly. A forgotten soldier, a hidden bunker, and a German shepherd who had uncovered it. Days passed. Federal investigators arrived. They examined every document Samuel Carter had left behind. The evidence was undeniable. The operation Carter had discovered decades earlier was finally exposed. The men connected to it, along with several companies tied to the cover-up, faced investigation. Richard Doyle disappeared before authorities could question him. But the truth was already out, and it wasn't going away. Weeks later, Walter returned to his cabin in the Bitterroot Mountains. The snow had melted slightly, revealing patches of green grass in the clearing. Atlas stepped out of the truck first. The dog walked slowly across the yard, sniffing the familiar air. Walter carried a small wooden sign and hammered it into the ground near the porch. Kevin watched from the truck. "What does it say?" Walter stepped back and read the words carved into the wood. Carter Ridge. Kevin smiled. "That's a good name." Walter looked across the mountains. This land belonged to him first. Atlas sat beside the porch. The scar on his shoulder had begun to heal, a reminder of the night he had nearly lost everything protecting his friend. Walter sat down beside him. He rested his hand on the dog's head. "You know what's funny?" Atlas tilted his head slightly. Walter looked out toward the endless ridges of Montana. "When you started digging under that floor, I thought you were chasing a mouse." Atlas's tail thumped against the wooden porch. Walter chuckled quietly. "But you weren't, were you?" The wind moved through the tall pine trees. Sunlight poured across the valley. Kevin stood beside the truck, watching the two of them. Walter leaned back in the old porch chair. For the first time in many years, his mind felt quiet. No war, no anger, no ghosts from the past. Just the mountains, and the loyal dog who had led him here. Atlas hadn't just found a bunker beneath an old cabin. He had found something far more important. A second chance. Walter scratched behind the dog's ears. "Good work, partner." Atlas rested his head on Walter's knee, and high above the Bitterroot Mountains, the sky stretched wide and clear. For the first time in decades, Walter Hayes had truly come home. If this story touched your heart, take just 1 second and leave a simple comment below. You can comment 1 if you believe a loyal dog can change a person's life, or comment 0 if you believe every veteran deserves a place to finally call home. And if you're watching this from somewhere in the world right now, tell us where you're watching from. Walter and Atlas may be in the mountains of Montana, but our community is everywhere.
Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell, because more powerful stories about courage, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between veterans and their dogs are coming very soon. Until the next story, take care of each other and never underestimate the heart of a loyal dog.